Chapter 3. While the drains beneath the regular city streets shared a common, unpleasant odor, you could never be certain what you might encounter in the tunnels beneath the arcane quarter. Garrett's luck proved good tonight. A stream of pinkish goop oozed down the central channel. It smelled faintly of orchids, and Garrett guessed that Mr. Elby, their apothecary neighbor, had once again failed to create the perfect love potion. At least he had given up on his dream of a universal solvent. The fumes from that one had nearly killed Garrett last spring. Garrett arrived at a stone archway in the side of the tunnel, its keystone a single piece of quartz crystal carved in the shape of a skull. A witchfire sconce illuminated the broad stairway beyond. Garrett was home. Garrett's feet throbbed with every step. The cold stone felt like a personal insult through the thin soles of his boots. At last he made it to the landing and the stained, scarred oak door to Uncle's basement. He laid his burdens down and fished for the key in the pocket of his robe. The door wrenched open before him, and Uncle Tingen looked down, his bushy gray eyebrows bunched together in the middle as he frowned. "You're late." "Sorry, Uncle," Garrett said, quickly snatching up the torn parcel and holding it in front of him. "I got the package." Uncle took the package in his bony hands. Bits of sparkling fleece poked through the ripped paper. "Curiosity get the better of you?" he asked. "No, sir," Garrett said, and then fell silent. Excuses never went well with the old necromancer. "Clean yourself off and meet me in the dining room when you're done. We have something to discuss." Garrett hurried upstairs. The witchfire candle atop his dresser sputtered into life the moment he opened the door to his bedroom, but he did not bother lighting a lamp. He hastily swapped his dirty robe and boots for a pair of slippers and a fresh shirt. Garrett glanced at the smudgy mirror that hung beside his wardrobe, then pulled a clean hood from a drawer and tugged it on over his head. Uncle had always pretended not to notice Garrett's scars. Garrett wished that he could do the same. He left his gloves behind, his single concession to informality. Garrett walked back downstairs to the dining room. The huge double doors were closed, but enough light shone through the gap at the bottom to dimly illuminate the dark hall outside. A pair of undead servants flanked the doors, awaiting Garrett's arrival. The mummified zombies, dressed in brocade doublets, watched his approach with milk-white eyes. They seemed to smile at him, though Garrett knew it was only the way their shrunken lips were drawn back over their polished teeth. Their joints creaked as they reached to pull the doors open for him. The brightness of the room beyond dazzled Garrett's eyes momentarily, and he marveled that Uncle would have lit so many lamps for their evening meal. Then Garrett's face broke into a broad grin when he saw the table heaped with food and presents and every necromancer he knew standing beside it. "Happy birthday, Garrett!" they called in unison. Uncle Tingen strode forward and placed his hand on Garrett's shoulder, ushering the bewildered boy into the room. 3 years ago today, Tingen said, we gained a new member of our rather unusual family. The necromancers laughed and raised their wine cups in toast. More than a few of the younger men in the room called Tingen uncle, though to Garrett's knowledge the old man had no blood relations at all. He was a mentor and a father to the fatherless, well-respected and well-loved. 13 is a lucky number for us, Tingen said. And a boy who's survived for 13 years shows promise of surviving long enough to pursue a vocation. Why, he could be a riverboat captain, Maximilian Zara cried out with mock sincerity. The dark-haired young man with the crooked grin was one of Tingen's orphans, a brilliant necromancer and the closest thing Garrett had to an older brother. He's shown quite an aptitude for tomb robbery from what I've heard, said Jitlo, a gaunt necromancer from Jad. He had a colorless glass eye that seemed perfectly suited to his eternally deadpan expression. He never told them what he had done to earn banishment from the opulent Delta state, and everyone seemed to prefer not knowing. That's hardly a noteworthy skill in present company, said Cynic. The man's runic facial tattoos, black braided hair, and short muscular build seemed incongruous with his immaculately tailored robe and impeccable manners. The twin blades hanging from his belt, 2 long and wickedly curved knives, were the only souvenirs he retained from the savage jungles of Nishat where Tingen had found him as a boy. Tingen cleared his throat loudly. If I may continue, Sorry, Uncle, spoke several at once. Well, to get to the point, I would like to take my nephew Garrett as my apprentice and would put it to a vote of the Brotherhood. Garrett looked up at Uncle Tingen in amazement. He had never really expected to be allowed into the secretive cabal of necromancers. While he had often assisted Uncle in the many unpleasant daily tasks involved with bringing the dead back to a semblance of life, he had never been allowed inside Uncle's secret workshop beneath the manor house. Corpses went in, the doors were shut. When they opened again, zombies came out. The idea that he could ever do that kind of magic made his head swim. An excellent idea and an excellent choice, Zara said. Let all in favor say so. The dining hall resounded with the voices of every necromancer present. That sounded unanimous, Cynic said with a smile. The necromancers pressed forward to shake Garrett's hand. Tingen stood back for a few moments to let them offer their congratulations, then he shooed them away as he knelt on one knee before Garrett. Let the first gift be from me then, my boy, he said, lifting a glittering chain from his pocket. At the end hung the talisman of a true necromancer, a golden medallion cast in the shape of a horned skull. It matched the talisman that Tingen wore in every detail. Uncle placed it over Garrett's head and laid the heavy pendant on the boy's chest. Garrett tried to speak, but the voice wouldn't come out right. Tears welled in the corner of his eyes, and he saw the same in Tingen's eyes as well. Welcome to the Brotherhood, Garrett, Tingen said, smiling as he placed his hands on Garrett's shoulders. A chorus of welcomes sounded throughout the room. All right, Zara said. Now that he's in, I can give him my present. The roguish young man stepped forward with a slim book, bound in black leather, and placed it in Garrett's hands as Uncle Tingen stepped away. Thanks, Garrett said, opening the cover to read the title page. A treatise on the use of vital energies in performing wild magic. Uncle Tingen groaned. You probably shouldn't read any more of that particular book out loud, Zara said with a nervous chuckle. Just to be safe. He's going to be learning real necromancy in my house, Tingen said. I know, Zara said. It's just a bit of casual reading for his spare time. Cynic gave Zara a stern look as he stepped forward to offer his gift. Garrett flinched as the savage-looking Neshite knelt before him. Though he knew Cynic to be a kind and gentle man, the boy still found the necromancer's appearance a bit intimidating. Cynic's tattooed face softened with a faint smile as he produced a thick leather belt and wrapped it around Garrett's waist. The scabbard of a curved jungle knife hung to one side of the belt. Don't put all of your faith in magic, boy, Cynic said. Sometimes the best solution is a sharp blade. Garrett nodded and thanked Cynic for the gift. One by one, the other necromancers stepped forward to offer little tokens of their friendship to the boy. Soon a half-dozen undead servants entered the room, carrying steaming plates of roasted meat, and the men's attentions turned to the food and to talk of the war. Garrett did not care much for war talk, but found it an impossible subject to avoid. Every day new reports came in of lands and forces lost to the relentless Shadirian horde. He chose at least to stand nearest to the most optimistic of the war talkers, Maximilian Zara. Have you heard? The Sisterhood is going to allow necromancers to travel with the army, Zara said, his eyes flashing eagerly. Uncle Tingen only grunted in response, a wary look on his face. I think Zara's most excited about the young priestess they've put in charge of this little expedition, Cynic said. It's not like that, Zara laughed. You have to see this as an opportunity. I know exactly what sort of opportunity you're thinking of, Cynic said. No, I mean, she is rather attractive, I'll give you that. But think of this. The Sisterhood is finally willing to admit that we actually exist. They want to work with us side by side. We could see how their magic works firsthand. What do you think, Uncle? Cynic said. Tingen's face darkened. If the Sisterhood is asking for help, they must be getting desperate. Then it's high time we get in there and show them how real necromancers deal with a problem, Zara insisted. With wild magic? Tingen asked. Come now, Zara said, looking slightly offended. Ask Cynic here about the time a little wild magic knocked that hungry hill troll from off his back." Cynic nodded. "True enough, although you did drain an entire flask of essence doing it, and singed the shirt and most of the hair off my back in the process." "But it worked." "Technically, yes." "There you have it," Zara said. Garrett did his best to hide a yawn with the back of his sleeve. Tingen noticed. "It's getting late, Garrett," Uncle said. "You'd better get to bed." Garrett groaned, but knew better than to argue. He gathered up as many of his gifts as he could carry and said good night to everyone. "Oh, before you go," Tingen said, "you have one more gift." He pointed toward a table in the corner of the room upon which sat a smallish object beneath a cover of red silk. "What is it?" Garrett said. "It arrived for you earlier," Tingen said. "I believe it is a gift from your young vampire acquaintance." "Marla sent me a gift?" Garrett asked. "That or a severed monkey head, judging by the size and shape," Cynic said. "You'd better go and check in case it is. It's not a good sign when a young lady sends you a monkey head. Trust me on that." Garrett laughed politely, though he could never be certain when Cynic was joking. Garrett hurried to the table and lifted the red cloth. Beneath it lay a little silver birdcage, a birdcage containing something extraordinary. "A fairy," Garrett said. The tiny creature, no bigger than Garrett's thumb, lay at the bottom of the cage. She glowed with a warm light that shifted in hue from pink to purple to orange. Her wings, as delicate as a dragonfly's, fluttered with a faint whirring sound as she looked up at him, seeming to wake up from a restless sleep. She watched him with uncertainty in her lambent blue eyes. "A real fairy!" Garrett exclaimed. "A very fine gift," Uncle Tingen remarked. "Indeed," Jitlo said. "Only the wealthiest of the Jardin can afford to keep such pets." Cynic made a rude noise. "It is not a pet," he said. "A fairy is a potent and elder spirit. Garrett, you are fortunate to have been given such a companion. You must give it a name, and give it quickly to seal the bond." Garrett stared back, flabbergasted. Zara laughed. "You heard the savage. Think of a name, Garrett, double quick." Garrett's exhausted brain reeled as his eyes darted around the room, searching for inspiration. They fell on one of the many witch-fire sconces that lit the room. "Lamp-wick," he blurted out. Cynic smiled, and Zara nodded in approval. Garrett looked down at the fairy, and she tilted her head to the side, studying him. "That will be enough for one evening," Uncle said. "Garrett, take Lamp-wick upstairs and get to bed." Garrett had to leave most of his gifts downstairs, but he managed to make it to his room with Lamp-wick's cage in hand, Zara's book tucked under one arm, and Cynic's knife on his hip. He was able to kick off one of his shoes before he slumped across his bed, already asleep. Chapter 4. Garrett kept waking up in his old bed in the room above the stairs in the little house above his father's bakery. He knew it was a dream, but each time he made himself wake up and found himself once again nestled beneath that soft patchwork quilt, he wished more and more that it was real. He wondered if maybe he could make it true just by wanting it and believing hard enough. He sat up in his dream bed and looked around the room, marveling at the clarity of the vision. Garrett's heart ached to see the sunlight shine through the little window upon the wooden planks of the floor. His old desk sat against the wall, cluttered with a young boy's treasures. The wooden sword that Graham had carved for him stood proudly in the corner. The smell of baking bread filled the room, and his mother's voice echoed up the stairs. She sang to him in a strange language, a sad melody in lilting, beautiful words he could not comprehend. Garrett woke up again. The gray gloom of dawn crept in beneath the shuttered blinds of the room in the Necromancer's house. Garrett rolled over onto his elbow in the bed, rubbing at his eyes. Something hard dug into his hip. He still wore the knife Cynic had given him, belted around his waist. Then he blinked, wondering if he still dreamed, for the strange and beautiful song continued. The fairy sat in her cage on the corner of his bedside table, singing. Garrett sat up and listened. He did not know what the words meant, but they filled his heart with a joyful longing for a lost home. The fairy sat with her back to him, looking toward the dim light of the window. She shone with an inner glow, a brilliant, pulsing light that one moment was the color of sunlight on a meadow, the next the color of a cloudless sky. Garrett watched and listened, desiring to neither distract nor frighten her. He knew that he would see again those visions of lost home if he closed his eyes for a moment, but he dared not let them shut. Going there and coming back again would break his heart. At last her song came to an end. Her light faded into a soft pink glow, and her head bowed in silence. Garrett wiped a tear from his cheek. He cleared his throat, feeling inexplicably ashamed. "Good morning, Lamp-wick," he said. The little fairy turned to look at him, her light flickering like a candle flame caught in a cold draft. For a moment, a shadow fell across her, and only her shining blue eyes blinked up at him. Garrett drew back, worried that he'd frightened her. He smiled and said, "Thank you for the song. It was really good." Lamp-wick's wings fluttered as she backed against the far side of her cage. She watched Garrett warily, but her blushing glow had returned. "I didn't know you could talk," Garrett said. "I don't understand what you were saying. Do you know how to speak Glorin?" Lamp-wick stared up at him, her eyes narrowed. "My name's Garrett. I only named you Lamp-wick because I had to think of something fast. Do you have a different name that you go by?" She tilted her head slightly, one of her tiny pointed ears pricked up beneath her short violet hair. Her lips moved slowly, testing the word before she spoke it. "Lamp-wick." Garrett grinned. He wasn't sure what came next. He'd never had a pet before. "Companion," corrected Cynic's voice in his head. He tried to remember the time that Graham had brought home the wounded raven. Father had said that it would probably die, and Graham shouldn't set his hopes too high. It had lived, though, and Graham was proud to have proved Father wrong. Graham and Garrett had fed the bird every hour, taking turns staying awake at night. Birds didn't eat much, but they ate often. "Are you hungry, Lamp-wick?" he asked. She looked up at him, her face a mask of incomprehension. "Wait here," he said. "I'll get you something." Garrett ran downstairs, lightening his step slightly when he saw Zara sprawled across the couch in the hall. He had one of Uncle's favorite books draped across his face, muffling his snores. Garrett pushed open the kitchen door as quietly as he was able. The kitchen zombie lifted its head expectantly as Garrett entered. It had no official name. Uncle Tingen didn't believe in naming zombies. Other necromancers often gave nicknames or titles to their undead creations, but Uncle called it pointless sentimentality. Garrett was careful to never let Uncle catch him doing it. "Good morning, Tom," Garrett said. The zombie creaked into motion, stepping from the gloomy corner where it spent most of its existence. Garrett stopped it with a wave of his hand. "I don't need any help, Tom, thanks," Garrett said. He hastily gathered a bit of fresh bread and a handful of grapes from the pantry. He briefly considered the sausages hanging from a peg on the door, but he couldn't imagine a fairy hunting for meat in the wild. He grabbed a teacup and a bottle of water and headed upstairs. Daylight, as much as could ever be expected, lit his bedroom by the time he returned. Garrett set the food on the table by Lamp-wick's cage and opened the shutters. People moved through the street below. Garrett squinted his eyes and tried to envision monstrous skeletal creatures lumbering down the same lane, but the previous night's events seemed little more than a bad dream now. Garrett returned to the cage and stooped to unfasten the tiny silver latch. Lamp-wick's eyes went to the door of the cage. Garrett hesitated. What if the fairy got loose and flew away? What would he tell Marla? Though he might find a way to fit the bread and grapes through the bars, the teacup would never go. Garrett bit his lip and opened the cage door. Lamp-wick flew toward the opening, a blur of light and buzzing wings. A bright flash and a bang filled Garrett's room. Suddenly Lamp-wick lay on the floor of the cage, clutching her shoulder and writhing in pain. A scent like the wind after a thunderstorm hung in the air. Garrett stood, mouth agape. Vampire magic bound Lamp-wick to her cage. She could no more pass through the open cage door than Garrett could through a stone wall. "I'm sorry," Garrett said. I... Lamp-wick glared at him, her eyes full of anger and hurt. "I just wanted to give you something to eat," he said. Garrett tore off a piece of bread and pushed it through the cage door. Lamp-wick hopped to the far side of the cage, still massaging her arm with her other hand. Garrett poured a little water into the teacup and set it inside the cage as well. Lamp-wick watched him but made no move toward the bread or water. Garrett pulled a grape from the bunch and placed it next to the bread. As he withdrew his fingers, the grape rolled free, wobbling to a stop at Lamp-wick's feet. The fairy looked down at the fruit. She glanced at Garrett again to assure herself that he had not moved. Then she knelt and passed her hand across the smooth skin of the grape. She smiled, leaning forward to wrap her arms around the fruit. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply as though savoring the scent of it. Garrett brought one of the grapes to his nose, sniffing. He smelled nothing. He popped it in his mouth and crunched it. It tasted like an ordinary grape. "It's all right to eat," he said, putting another grape in his mouth. "See? They're good." Lamp-wick's eyes rose, no longer angry. She smiled at him, and he smiled back. "Garrett!" Uncle called from downstairs. "Breakfast!" "Oh, sorry," Garrett said, hastily shoving the rest of the grapes into Lamp-wick's cage. She fluttered clear of a rolling grape, looking slightly annoyed. Garrett thought of closing the cage door, but it seemed rude somehow and rather unnecessary. Garrett started out the bedroom door, pausing as he realized he was still wearing the shirt he'd slept in. He hurried to grab a fresh one and was about to pull the old one off when he realized that Lamp-wick was watching him. He froze. Garrett sidled out of the room, changing quickly in the hallway. He tossed the old shirt back through the door and headed downstairs. Uncle Tingen waited for him at the breakfast table. The kitchen zombie poked sluggishly at a mound of raw bacon piled in the center of an iron pan by the fire. Garrett sat down just as a bleary-eyed Maximilian Zara staggered into the room, looking about as alert as Tom the zombie. "You could have let me sleep," Zara mumbled, vainly attempting to smooth his unruly brown hair with his hands. "Sleep late in your own house," Uncle Tingen said without looking up from his tea. The zombie shambled over to set a plate of cold biscuits in front of Garrett. "Thanks, Ta," Garrett said, almost saying the zombie's name before Uncle's look of disapproval cut him off. "So, Garrett," Zara said, "how does it feel to be an unholy agent of the dark powers?" "Huh?" Garrett asked, stuffing a biscuit in his mouth. "A necromancer, Garrett," Zara laughed. "Now that you're one of us, you're going to have to start taking your role as a merciless harrower of souls more seriously." Garrett blinked at him. "I'll take you out shopping for fiery crowns and implements of torture after breakfast." "What you do after breakfast is your own business," Uncle said. "But this young man has work to do." "Work, work, work," Zara scoffed as he poured himself a cup of tea. "I suppose that's one way to spend your day." "You should try it sometime," Uncle said. "I keep meaning to," Zara said, gulping down his tea. "I just can't seem to fit it into my busy schedule." "What is it exactly that you do with your time?" Tingen asked. "Research, dear Uncle, research." Uncle Tingen snorted. "Speaking of which, I have some research to attend to at the temple this afternoon." Uncle's shaggy brows furrowed. "Be careful, Max," he said. "It was not that long ago that the sisterhood hunted us as heretics." Zara flashed his crooked grin. "Never fear, Uncle. I'll be the one doing the hunting this time." Uncle set his teacup aside and looked Zara in the eye. "You don't know what they're capable of." "And they don't know what I'm capable of," Zara said. He pushed back from the table suddenly and stood. He assumed his most aloof expression and bowed floridly. "I'll leave you both to this work business. Others need my wisdom too, and I must away." A faint smile tickled the corner of Tingen's frown. "Be off then, but stop by this evening. Garrett and I may have something to show you." Garrett sat up in his chair, curious now. Zara arched an eyebrow. "I wouldn't miss it." He waved his goodbyes and swept from the room. "What are we going to do?" Garrett asked. Uncle Tingen regarded him coldly. "First," he said, "we're going to finish eating breakfast. Then you are going to raise your first zombie. Garrett felt a strange tingle on the back of his neck, though he wasn't sure if it was excitement or fear. And yes, Uncle said, crunching a piece of charred bacon, you can name this one. Chapter 5. The black oak doors of Uncle Tingin's laboratory swung open on tarnished brass hinges. At the center of the circular room beyond squatted a gray slab of polished granite. Stretched upon the stone slab was the body of a young man. His eyes were closed, and, if not for the large sutured wound in his chest and his bloodless complexion, he would have appeared to be sleeping. Not all who linger in the streets after curfew are so lucky as you, Uncle Tingen said. Garrett said nothing, but followed Uncle toward the corpse on the table. Garrett noticed that the body lay upon the sparkling fleece that he had brought home with such difficulty the previous night. A shimmer fleece, Uncle said. They are found only in the mountains at the headwaters of the great river Nishat. I encountered a fragment of one among the river tribesmen once years ago. Until now, I have never seen one whole. What does it do? Uncle Tingen smiled. I would very much like to know myself. Garrett had seen the gleam of curiosity in his uncle's eyes only a few times before, and this made him afraid. If Uncle didn't know something, it was likely to be the sort of thing that no one had yet survived to write about. He took an unconscious step away from the table. Going somewhere? Uncle raised an eyebrow. Should I get an essence flask? Garrett asked. No need, Uncle said. I've set aside a bit of essence already. Garrett watched in amazement as Uncle opened the elixir cabinet and took an old bottle down from the top shelf. A bright blue-green glow shone from it even through its thick coating of dust. What is that? Garrett whispered, hardly daring to breathe. Uncle smiled. This is the essence of a satyr thief. Quite an accomplished burglar in his time. He once stole a necklace from around the neck of a Jadin empress. His bones have long since crumbled to dust, but this remains. It is the last of him. Garrett did not know what to say and remained silent. I think today is the day we set our larcenous friend loose upon the land once more. But, Garrett said, it won't really be him, though. I mean, the essence just animates the zombie, right? They still can't think for themselves or remember things, can they? Uncle Tingen looked at him for a long moment before speaking. You've been paying attention, I'll give you that. Of course, you're right. Zombies have no memory of their past lives, and I've never found any evidence that the nature of the essence used to animate them makes much difference in the final results. Still, as long as we're trying something new, we may as well stack the cards in our favor. New? To my knowledge, Uncle said, no necromancer has ever used a shimmer fleece in the performance of a resurrection. That is to say, no necromancer before you. Garrett's heart nearly stopped. Wouldn't you rather... I don't want to use the last of the special essence. What if I mess it up? Uncle regarded him coldly. I would advise against messing it up, then. Garrett's insides turned over a time or two, and his mind raced with what little he knew of the necromancer's trade. What is the first step? Uncle asked. Get a body? Garrett said, and then winced at the look on Uncle's face. The next step? We see if the essence will take to it, Garrett said. Very good, Uncle Tingen said. However, we'll be trying something new today. That hardly seemed fair, Garrett thought, but he kept this feeling to himself. Uncle broke the red wax seal atop the bottle of essence and worked the ancient cork free with some difficulty. It opened with a hollow-sounding pop. Take the flask, Garrett. Garrett reached up to take the bottle with both hands, terrified that he might drop it. He had expected it to be cold, but the flask radiated a discomforting warmth as though it were filled with fresh blood. I want you to walk around the slab, Uncle said, pouring the essence out onto the fleece around the body. It must form an unbroken outline, and you must be certain that you have enough left over at the end to complete the outline. Do you understand?" Garrett nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good. Begin." Garrett lifted the heavy flask, tipping the mouth of it over the shimmering wool of the fleece at the spot nearest the young man's shoulder. He poured out an unbroken, if slightly unsteady, stream of liquid essence onto the sparkling wool. He walked slowly around the table as he poured. He marveled at the size of the shimmer fleece stretched beneath the corpse. The creature that it came from must have been larger than a man. Garrett wondered how he had been able to carry the fleece at all. It must be far lighter than it looked. "Careful," Uncle said. Garrett had to reverse the trail of the poured essence, looping it back to cover a small gap. He was careful not to repeat his mistake. By the time he had circled the table and returned to his starting point, the essence had soaked almost completely into the fleece, the spot where the trail began now barely visible. Garrett upended the bottle, pouring the last of the satyr essence into the fleece. Uncle took the cold, empty bottle from Garrett's hands. "Well done." Garrett allowed himself to breathe again and stepped back from the table. Uncle picked up an old hide-bound book from the workbench and cracked it open before handing it to Garrett. The book's spine bore a deep crease, and the binding had begun to fray apart at this particular page. "The Calling of the Dead," Garrett read the heading aloud. The title and the incantation below were written in Glorin. "You seem puzzled," Uncle noted. "I just thought magic would be written in some strange language," Garrett said. Uncle smiled. "It isn't the words you use that matter, but the will and the intent behind them. You must mean what you say, and the essence will answer. Do you understand?" Garrett nodded, not at all certain that he did. "Of course I have the same spell written in Old Draconic if you want to sound more impressive while you're casting it," he said, setting his finger on the spine of an enormous black book. "No, this is fine." "Good. Now face the table and form in your mind an image of the essence inside the fleece." Garrett closed his eyes and imagined the glowing liquid seeping through the white curls of the wool. "Now read aloud the words written in the book." Garrett opened his eyes and read from the page. "Fallen ones, I bid you rise. Spirit and flesh undone, now mend." "Stop," Uncle said. "Don't speak to the book. Don't speak to me. Speak to the essence. And speak with a voice that cannot be ignored, not even by the dead." Garrett hesitated. "What do you mean?" he asked. Uncle Tingen strode forward, his long fingers tapping the skull medallion on Garrett's chest. "Your voice has to come from your heart. You have to mean the words. The essence has no choice but to obey, for you are a necromancer, and the dead answer your call." Garrett's mouth had gone dry. He licked his lips and turned his attention back to the corpse on the table. He spoke again, his voice louder, insistent. "Fallen ones, I bid you rise. Spirit and flesh undone, now mend. To the spirit a body given, to the flesh a quickening gift." As he spoke, his words hardened, losing their uncertain tone and reverberating with the timbre of command. "Join as one, O wisp and bone. Join in strength and know new life. Fallen ones, now one, arise. I give you life to serve my call." Garrett's skin tingled with the rush of power. He could feel the spirit that stirred upon the slab, not quite alive, but no longer dead. It writhed and recoiled from the cold, strange flesh of the pallid corpse. It did not wish to obey. "Again, boy!" Uncle shouted. Garrett held the book open with one hand, clutching his gold medallion with the other. Its comforting weight grew warm in his grasp as he read the words aloud again. A fine, glowing mist began to form upon the corpse's white skin. The essence rose like a billowing cloud from the fleece to envelop the dead young man. Garrett's hand ached upon the amulet, his eyes wide as he shouted the words again. Suddenly, the corpse's arm twitched. Its leg bounced on the slab. Garrett released the amulet and stretched forth his hand over the body. The words of the spell rolled from his tongue. The dead man arched his back. One hand clawed at the fleece. Its head turned toward Garrett, and its eyes opened. The words came from Garrett's mouth with no aid from the written page, but this time, when he came to the end, he did not begin again. He simply said, "Rise!" The zombie sat bolt upright on the slab, gasping for breath. It looked straight ahead with an expression of horror upon its face and uttered a terrible, anguished moan. Garrett suddenly felt as though he had just dropped an armload of heavy stones. He sagged forward, leaning against the table and breathing heavily. "Well done," Uncle said, clapping Garrett on the back so hard that it stung. Garrett smiled weakly and started to speak, but his vision went all gray and the floor suddenly rushed up toward him. He felt a cold hand closing around his arm as the blackness swallowed him up.